My name is Katie White, and I work with the Heart and Stroke Foundation of Canada, and I lead what's called our health systems portfolio, which means I have the privilege of supporting the team responsible for the Canadian Stroke Best Practice recommendations. And as a part of that role, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing this year's winners of both the Hnatyshyn and Niebuhr lectures. Both of these lectures honor individuals who have exemplified leadership, persistence, and dedication to making the world of stroke care better for everyone by advancing research and implementation to improve outcomes and advancing the impact of lived experience in driving change, respectively. These lectureships are jointly awarded by the Heart and Stroke, the Canadian Stroke Consortium, the Canadian Neurological Sciences Federation, and CanStroke Recovery Trials. I'll first introduce our Hnatyshyn Lecturer for 2026, and after we hear from Dr. Sharma, I'll introduce our Niebuhr Lecturer. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mike Sharma as this year's 2026 Hnatyshyn Lecturer Award winner. The Hnatyshyn Lecture was founded in 2003 in honor of Canada's 24th Governor-General, Raymond J. Hnatyshyn. He was a founding board member of the Canadian Stroke Network and a strong advocate and supporter of stroke research. Dr. Sharma wears many hats. He's a professor of neurology at McMaster University, director of the Brain Health and Stroke Research Program at the Population Health Research Institute, holds the Michael G. DeGroot Chair in Stroke Prevention, and serves as the medical director of the Central South Regional Stroke Network, which for some reason I have a lot of trouble with. Over the course of his career, Dr. Sharma has made profound contributions to stroke care, both in Canada and around the globe, authoring more than 170 peer-reviewed publications. Most recently, he has led the OCEANIC-STROKE trial, demonstrating the promise of factor XIa inhibitors for secondary stroke prevention, which many of you heard about at lunch today, helping to place Canada at the forefront of stroke anticoagulation research, and importantly, improving the prevention of recurrent stroke for many. He has been a leader in developing systems of care that ensure that those advances reach the patients that we are doing the research for, contributing to national guidelines, stroke networks, and of course, collaborative research efforts. Beyond all of that work, if it wasn't enough, he is a committed mentor and educator, helping to inspire the next generation of stroke leaders. Today, we look forward to hearing his reflections on discovery, innovation, and the future of stroke prevention, science, and care. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Sharma.
Katie, thank you so much for that kind introduction. Let me tell you, when I got the letter of nomination and the letter that I had been named, I was quite touched. Most of your life, when you're working, going forward, you are looking ahead. You forget to look back to see the pathway that you've trod, the distance that you've come. So today, amongst other things, I'm going to advise you all to take a moment, look backwards, look at all that you've done and gone forward. I'm touched by all the colleagues that wrote. I have a hard time reading what they wrote because I get misty-eyed. Now, I'm a grown man. I don't cry. I do have allergies. And that's it. I have deep gratitude for this honor, something I never imagined or expected. Now, I'm going to tell you a story. In truth, there'll be several stories, and anyone who knows me knows how I can get with the stories. Most of what I tell you will be true, at least as I recall it. There's some advice peppered through it, and I'd be happy if there were some young folks in the crowd just to reflect on the observation I've had through my life. There's some pictures of people, all provided with their consent, mostly. The ones I didn't seek consent for were where I found the picture on the internet. I thought consent was assumed there. I am a professor, and I may become somewhat pedantic. Please excuse me. Now, I have a great deal of trouble talking about myself, so here I go. This is where I grew up. This is where I'm from. Childhood in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, I remember as a wonderful time. When I was a kid growing up, that city had a population of about 65,000 people. Now, since then, I've been in sports stadiums with a capacity greater than that. But then that was my whole world. Dartmouth is a beautiful place. There are 20-odd lakes within the city limits. So we grew up as children building forts, building snow castles, skating on ponds, playing hockey on ponds. Hockey back then was with relatively cheap skates, a stick with a plastic blade that you heated with the help of your mother over the stove to curve it. And none of these fancy sticks for us. We use pads made out of catalogs. Now, if you're old enough, you may remember what that was, but you took rubber bands, strapped them on your legs, and they stopped pucks and prevented you from getting bruised. I remember it as a wonderful time. Summers that seemed to last forever, summers where we always had some plan, friends and I, to build something, do something remarkable, go someplace on our bikes that we'd never been before, which we imagined would be amazing. Now, my memory is quite rosy. There are some parts of it which were difficult. I remember being a little kid. This would have been in grade 2, and being in class and being asked out of class to go to the principal's office. Now, at that age, I'm not sure I was even afraid of the principal's office. I just knew it was something odd. There were some puzzles to do, some things to read and write. Went back to my class, and then someone came and said, pick up your things. You're going to a new class. Walked into the new class. There was sunlight streaming in my memory, a wall full of books, and the way I remember it, the sound of a chorus of angels. I loved books. What I discovered later on was when I'd moved to the school, someone looked at my name. It was weird. It was foreign. And they decided I couldn't be very clever. At that point in time, children were streamed into a high academic level, the ordinary level, and what's called vocational, even at that young age. And they put me in the lowest category. My mother was a school teacher, and she said, look, give him whatever test you want, but I don't think he belongs there. And that was what had happened. If it had not been for her, I don't know where I would have ended up. I'd like to think somehow I still would have found a path here, but I doubt it. Now, I don't say that to say that we are an exceptionally biased people. I say that because we are not. If you travel internationally, by the way, my allergies are acting up, so I apologize for that. If you travel internationally, you'll find that Canadians actually are wonderful. We're not bigoted. We're not biased. We have our problems, but we do overall a wonderful job. By the way, if you ever want to get a Nova Scotian teary-eyed, start singing Farewell to Nova Scotia. That'll do it. So in high school, I liked physics. There was a time when this man, Carl Sagan, who was a physicist, an astrophysicist, was quite popular. If you remember nothing else from what I say this afternoon, just know one thing he said. When the universe was born, the only element was hydrogen. All of the other elements are created inside stars through nuclear fusion. So we ourselves are made of star stuff, of the stuff that comes from stars. And that's quite amazing. He had this book and a television series. I was determined to become an astrophysicist. And I went after high school here to Dalhousie, determined to do a degree in physics. While doing it, I noticed that it was a rather lonely pursuit. I also noticed that I had no talent in the laboratory. The head of the department said, have you ever heard of Chen-Ning Yang? And I said, no. He said, well, he's a Nobel laureate. When he was a graduate student at the University of Chicago, they used to say, wherever there's a yang, there's a bang, because things would blow up around him. And see what he accomplished. Now, I still to this day have no talent practically, and I'm not a Nobel laureate, but my life took a different turn. Noticing that the pursuit of physics was a somewhat lonely field, I thought about medicine. I applied to medical school and got a letter, and the letter read, you have been accepted into the first year class of this year. You have to arrive at the Tupper building, just pictured on the right hand of the slide, at such and such a time in September 20th, I believe. If you do not arrive, your position will be given away. It's rather an ambiguous invitation, and I struggled with it all summer. I had been on my way to graduate school, and should I go to medical school? And I thought to myself, well, I'll try it. If I don't like it, I can always go to graduate school. So that's still my backup plan, is to go to graduate school. The Tupper Building, by the way, is named for the only Canadian Prime Minister who was a physician. He also was a Nova Scotian, hence the Tupper Building. After medical school, I went to a place that a lot of maritime kids go to find a job, find training, which was Ontario. So Western is where I did my residency. It was really a marvelous place to train in neurology. There I learned to excel, to not accept that things should just be okay. I was trained by people who were the best in their field, and there was so much academic activity going on that you could not help but be enthused by it. By the way, in the bus from Calgary Airport to Banff, I bumped into Brian Young, who was one of my mentors at Western. Brian hasn't changed in all these years. He still has this horrible tendency to make puns. He also has tremendous curiosity. As soon as he saw me, he says, "Oh, I have some things about stroke that I want to ask you." And off we went. While there, I bumped into Alistair Buchan one day in the elevator, a young man who watched as I pressed the button to the 7th floor where neurology was and said, "Are you a neurology resident?" Now, the name tag that I wore saying neurology and resident might have had something to do with it. But he introduced himself. He had just arrived back to take a faculty position after finishing his fellowship in New York in stroke. And he started to talk to me. He was one of these people who was enthusiastic, bright, and got you interested in whatever they were interested in. This led to a fellowship in Montreal. So as you can see, I've been making a tour of universities. My mentor was this man, Tony Hakeem. From Tony, I learned to think big. Amongst other things, Tony founded the Canadian Stroke Network, which was a network of centers of excellence. Now, this was funded by not Health Canada, but by Industry Canada. These networks were meant to make the country greater economically. It was the first health-associated network funded by Industry Canada. He thought big, acted big, and accomplished big things. Tony was a great guy to work with. I started in the lab, and my curse from physics followed me there. So what I can tell you is my laboratory career had a duration matched only by its lack of distinction. The lab was not for me. Tony moved to the University of Ottawa, the lab moved, and I with him. Now, one of the things I learned during residency and fellowship was really to face your limitations and stare them down. When I was a resident, I was terrified of public speaking. My voice had a tremor, not the allergies I have now, something quite different. Had a tremor, my hand shook. And in those days, you didn't have slides, you had an overhead projector, which blew up the image. So a little tremor became a massive oscillation on the screen in the amphitheater. This annoyed me tremendously. And I thought, I have to get rid of this. The only way to do it is to volunteer every single time. So I did it and did it and did it until it was just another thing. And that fear, that anxiety was gone. It came back today when I thought, oh, I have to talk about myself, which I don't like doing. But so far, so good. Look, if I was going to dedicate this lecture to anybody, it would be my family. These are our children. And if you have children, you know that they start off little. They worship you. They think you can do anything. You think you'll have all kinds of time for them. And then one day you turn around and you have to look up at one of these people. These guys are wonderful human beings. They're smart, they're funny, they're accomplished. As you may have guessed, they take after their brother. They have skills I did not have. One of them was a very good competitive hockey player. He can actually skate backwards, which I could never do. Another one does stand-up comedy for fun. So if you're in Montreal, you may see her. Now, one of the nice things about having children is the potential for grandchildren. And we've had our first grandchild a year and a half ago. Now, I didn't give up on physics. We went to visit at Easter, and this is a book I bought for him. And as you can tell, he has an aptitude for it. Now, this is a real book. You can get it on the internet, or if you're in Ottawa, at the Museum of Science and Technology. It's written by Chris Ferry, who's a physicist and thinks that if you demystify science starting early, it'll work. It is actually about quantum physics, and it's for babies. It says, this is an electron. This is an electron with energy. And it goes through electron shells and transitions. Great book. After we landed in Ottawa, I started working here at the Ottawa Hospital, the Civic. By that point, I decided it was going to be clinical research or nothing. One of the things that happened there was we started the stroke program. Now, Ottawa, in the province of Ontario, which had been rolling out the stroke program and stroke centers, was one of the last to be funded. The stroke program, for a period of time, consisted of me and a box of paper clips. And to be fair, I brought the paper clips. I got the data to see what our treatment rates were with TPA, with thrombolysis. Much to my dismay, they were the last in the province, extremely low. I was distressed briefly. And then I thought to myself, no matter what I do, it can't get worse than this. So that cheered me up greatly and go forward. If you're ever in that position, just remember, it can't possibly get worse. So do something. The treatment rate moved. It moved so quickly, I was called in front of the board to explain myself. They said, Doctor, you told us this was a potentially dangerous treatment. Why is it you're treating so many people? And we had to admit that we didn't know what the best treatment rate was, what the optimal rate was. We were just starting. By that point, Ottawa had surpassed other places in the province, and we were now getting calls to share what we'd done so that you can do it. And by the way, in clinical medicine, I like to say we practice R&D, rip off and duplicate. What that means is what works, we share broadly and freely, and for the good of our colleagues and our patients. This worked tremendously well. During that time, I was involved with the Canadian Stroke Consortium. Now, that organization started in the 90s as a collection of people who did clinical trials. The 90s were a period of time when there were a lot of trials going on, a lot of pharma companies with neuroprotectants, so many that there was competition between them, and this body was formed to get a unified way of negotiating with them, of looking at protocols and going forward. Over the years, that activity disappeared and it got tighter and tighter. I had, by that point, been involved as a member of this scientific committee, chair of the scientific committee, and then deputy chair, and then eventually chair. When I took over as chair, the organization was not in good shape. Initially, it wasn't clear if the only thing I'd be able to do was lay it in its grave with some dignity and move on to something else. But very similar to starting a stroke program, I looked at it and said, well, it can't get much worse than this. So we made some changes. We got a management team, Karen Earl and Clay Earl, who are very helpful in the business end of the organization. I then did the best thing I've ever done for the CSC, which is I left as chair, and I handed it over to Andrew Demchuk. If you don't know Andrew, just know this one fact. He is relentlessly optimistic. He manages to gather energy together, energetic people together, and get things moving. If you're going to do anything, the very first thing you need is a belief that it can be done. And Andrew has that aplenty. He's taken that organization to heights that I never dreamed of. Now, while in Ottawa, the stroke program was going well. We had fellows. We'd started a research program. I was entirely happy. And then this man called, Bob Hart. Bob said, hey, Mike, do you want to come down and visit us in Hamilton? And I'd never been to Hamilton. And my mental picture of Hamilton was what I bet is in all of your minds right now. It was a grimy industrial city, not one that's high on the list of places to visit. By the way, Hamilton is beautiful. Ashkan, do I lie? It is a city with waterfalls. There are deer that walk up our street, not the elk that you have here, but actual deer that walk up our street and eat the flowers. It is an enormously energized academic center. And once I visited on Bob's invitation, it was very hard to say no to the invitation to move there. I can tell you that that was not very popular with the family. Nobody but me and the dog were enthusiastic about this move. Now, to be fair, the dog is enthusiastic about everything. It is the nature of dogs. Bob Hart, who still lives in Dundas, came to us from the University of Texas. He'd spent his entire career there until he took the invitation to start a stroke program at McMaster at PHRI, where there had been nothing. Bob is the real reason the program exists, and much of what we've done exists. Reason I'm there, Ashkan, Aristides Katanos, Araya Jundi, Sashi Pereira, all of us due to Bob's work. One of the most important things for a mentor to do is to create opportunities, and Bob did that in spades for all of us. So if you're looking for a mentor, look for somebody who creates opportunities for you. If you are a mentor, do that. Get it going, get it moving. One of the tremendous things that I did with Bob was we created a new concept, and that was this ESIS. I'd never before seen an idea germinate into a construct that we actually wanted to treat. This is embolic strokes of undetermined source. So this, distressingly, is about 30% of the strokes we treat. We don't know the source of them. It's a collection of things that can occur. Some of them are atherosclerotic. Some of them are occult cardiac states or cardiac conditions which have a low risk of embolization. The construct came together like this. You had to have had a stroke. There had to be not a lot of narrowing in the blood vessels, proximal atherosclerosis, no atrial fibrillation, nothing we knew for sure caused strokes from the heart, and no other known cause of stroke. This came together at a meeting at the FDA, which Bob organized. His point was this, is if the FDA accepted it as a therapeutic target, then companies would be interested in funding research. And pharma-funded research is of a very large scale. It lets you get things done very quickly. So we went to the FDA campus. He asked me to talk on PFO. He said, look, I've heard you do it before, Mike. You do a good job. So I said, great. I said, Bob, who's the audience? And he gave me a list. Now, that list was everyone who was anyone in the stroke field, many of whom had written the papers I was going to cite. That day was actually really an exciting day as you heard these presentations go one to the other. At the end of the day, the head of the cardiorenal division, who was there, it's a division that oversees stroke at the FDA, was asked what he thought of the concept. He said exactly these words, I see a way forward. immediately, the people who would be funding things reached for their phones. There were Blackberries back then, but phones nevertheless, and started typing. The messages went out and trials were created. The theory was this. So most cryptogenic strokes are embolic. We know that it's very hard to pin down the source of them. Anticoagulation works for emboli, and we had these new molecules, the NOACs, which were safer than warfarin. So the hypothesis is for secondary prevention, anticoagulation would be more effective than antiplatelets, and it resulted in this trial, Navigate-ESUS. Now, Navigate-ESUS, we took people who fit that construct that we put together and randomized them to either anticoagulation with rivaroxaban or aspirin. I learned a tremendous amount during this trial, one of which was how to do global international trials. In Canada, in this country, when we're firing on all cylinders, we can get 20 sites. Now, you can do a lot with 20 sites, but you can't do trials with thousands of people in an efficient time frame. Those are the kind of trials which not even our children will finish, but our grandchildren will, if they're not physicists, that is. This trial was in 459 sites. We ran it. People were enthusiastic about the concept and did it. And then one day, there was this letter from the DMC. Basically, it said, we don't think this is going to work. Now, the job of the DMC is not to get your trial finished or done. The job is to protect participants. So if it looks like it's not going to succeed, if it looks like there is harm to participants, they will stop it, no matter what you say. Here, after we were unblinded, here's what we found. The rate of stroke with rivaroxaban and aspirin was almost exactly the same. The rate of hemorrhage, however, was not. More people who got rivaroxaban bled than aspirin. The DMC, as distressed as we were, did exactly the right thing and stopped the trial. Now, the hemorrhage rate on rivaroxaban was about what you expect based on what we saw in other trials. The aspirin rate, however, was lower. We're not quite sure why, other than chance, which made that difference really big and really significant. We looked at a number of subgroups. Now, one of the things to know about subgroups is subgroup analyses, even when they're pre-specified, can be quite misleading. Just because you've pre-specified it does not mean it'll lead to the truth. So if you look at geographic regions, it looks like it works in Western Europe and does not in North America. That actually makes no sense. But the Europeans, for a little while, were quite excited by this. And they really wanted to use it there. All of the other subgroups really were null. We did not find a subgroup where this would work. And a couple of other trials that happened since then, looking at promising ideas, like people who don't have atrial fibrillation, but are on the verge of having it. And it's failed there as well. Now, while we were busy sobbing into our pillows, this trial was ending at PHRI. This is COMPASS. And COMPASS was a trial that was run by John Eichelboom and Stuart Connolly, amongst others. I had the privilege of being on the steering committee. And if you want to talk about chances and opportunities, the way that came about was Bob came into my office one day. It was 5:30, late in the evening. He said, listen, we're getting this trial together, and I know you're interested in cognition and covert infarcts and covert brain damage. I think we can get about $3 million to study that. Would you like it? I fell out of my chair. Once I got up, I said, well, yes, I would. He said, I need about 4 typed pages. And when do you need it? I asked. Today, he said. So I called home, said, sorry, I won't be home for dinner. Got to work on it. And those pages were done and off to him. The opportunities are there if you grasp them, if you move them, if you reach for them. Now, unlike navigate-ESIS, COMPASS was stopped early because it was positive. This combination of low-dose rivaroxaban and aspirin reduced stroke and did so very well. The primary endpoint was MACE, but it was really driven by stroke. And there's a graph for the occurrence of stroke. So in blue, it's a combination of rivaroxaban and aspirin by itself, a significant and clear benefit. Here was a risk reduction for ischemic stroke. So compared to aspirin, ischemic stroke is cut almost 50%, and we don't see an offsetting increase in hemorrhage in the brain. Now, these were patients who had mostly coronary disease, so it took us a little while to sort out what was happening. Now, stroke is mainly, but not completely, an embolic condition. The emboli are composed mostly of blood clots. The blood clots are composed of fibrin and platelets and red blood cells in varying amounts. Our thinking previously had been to target either fibrin or platelets. What happened in COMPASS was targeting all of it at doses that worked safely together. And that was a secret and the magic of this dual pathway. So I started out wanting to do COMPASS in stroke patients. There was, however, fear of hemorrhage, and we couldn't get it funded. Somebody, and this is one of the marvelous things about PHRI, said, why don't you look at factor 11 inhibitors? And I said in my head, what's factor 11, and why would you want to inhibit it? Did a lot of reading to figure out what this was. This is a coagulation cascade, and I am responsible for a lot of horrible, complicated diagrams. So let me make it as easy as I can. This is a pathway you need to stop bleeding. Factor 11 is not in this pathway. It's over here, which is on a feedback loop. Simply put, factor 11 is not necessary for us to stop bleeding. And what evidence was there of that? Well, if you took mice and you knocked out factor 11, by the way, a lot of species don't have factor 11 at all, and the coagulation system in different species is different. So to develop these agents, companies have to test many different animal models. But if you took mice and you knocked out the factor 11 gene, they had small, measly blood clots, but they didn't bleed. In human beings, there is this factor 11 deficiency, which used to be called hemophilia C, but it's so different from hemophilia that we've stopped using that term. Your chance of being factor 11 deficient is about 1 in a million. There are parts of the world where it's much more common, like in the Ashkenazi Jewish population in Israel, where it may be as high as 1 in 450. People who have this have a very mild bleeding phenotype. It's first described in the Bronx by a family physician in a family who got recurrent nosebleeds, and that's all they had. As you look at all of that evidence, factor 11 deficiency is associated with a low risk of stroke, also a low risk of venous thromboembolism, and not much of a difference in the occurrence of MI. Now, we looked to see who had molecules that could affect factor 11 and activated factor 11A. There were two companies, BMS in collaboration with Janssen and Bayer. Now, these were at a very early stage of development. These companies have to make a decision about which molecule, which acid is going to go forward. So we arranged meetings with both of them. Germany and New Jersey, we flew down to make the case for stroke as a target for factor 11 inhibitors. We knew, and it took some years to convince them of that. What you have to remember is the decision for pharma companies is very complicated. You have a number of compounds, and you have to try to pick a winner. When these things go to phase 2, and there are a lot of hurdles just to get to phase 2, which is a dose-finding study, only about 20% of them make it out of phase 2. Finding new treatments, finding doses is a very hard process. we knew from COMPASS that the dose had to be right. So we proposed dose-finding trials in stroke patients. Now, this had never been done before because the rate of stroke is so low that they didn't think it was efficient. All of the doses that you and I use of antithrombotics were derived in a DVT population. And it's not surprising that they don't always work for our patients. So these were the first trials ever done. BMS bit first, and this was the axiomatic study design. Bayer came shortly after and said, yes, we'd like to proceed, and we'd like you to do it. So I went to the head of our institute, Salim Youssef, another fantastic force in the field of research. And I said, Salim, they're both interested now, but clearly we can't do both of them. They're competitors. We'd have to choose. He said, no, not necessarily. What ended up happening is we split our research team. We moved people's offices. We built a firewall so that no information could cross, made agreements with them. And then COVID hit and nobody was talking to anybody for a while. So we ended up doing both of these trials for about 2.5 years. The only thing I talked to Bob Hart about was barbecue recipes. And we couldn't talk science. We couldn't talk about how things were going. This is a design of axiomatic SSP. The primary endpoint was a combination of covert infarcts on MRI and clinically apparent stroke, and that was neutral. In a dose response study, what you expect to see is as you increase the dose, the occurrence goes down, kind of like a picture of a large family where the kids are born a year or 2 years apart, just like that. But this is what happened. When you looked at symptomatic stroke, you saw this. So every dose of asundexian was associated with a lower occurrence of symptomatic stroke than placebo, except for the highest dose. Now, why is that? How is it that it works, and then suddenly doesn't work? There was a lot of work that went into this, but what you have to think about with phase 2 trials, and we're all going to have to think differently, is essentially what they are is a bunch of small trials running in parallel. And small trials sometimes have wonky results, which is what we saw here. Pacific Stroke. Bob and Hnatyshyn, in seclusion from me, were running Pacific Stroke. And the fact we designed them separately worked very well because the designs were complementary. With asundexian, saw exactly the same thing. Primary outcome, not an effect, but we did see an effect when we looked at symptomatic stroke, and particularly some subtypes of symptomatic stroke, those ones which are associated with atherosclerosis, which led to the design of OCEANIC-STROKE. Now, one thing that still is a puzzle to me is why we did not affect the MRI-defined infarcts. In axiomatic, our endpoint was at 90 days at 3 months with MRI. The infarcts which occurred should have been directly related to the cause of the incident stroke. And yet, we had an effect on symptomatic stroke, not on covert infarcts. That is a problem we still have to solve. Results of OCEANIC, wildly positive, and this will, we feel, result in a change in secondary stroke prevention, strong benefits for our patients. Now, I've talked about these results, I think 3 times so far today, so I will not delve into them in detail. I want to talk about something else. We struck a committee to increase the diversity in our population in the trial. We wanted the trial to look like the patients we treated. More women, more other groups which are traditionally neglected. And this was a committee that we struck. And you may recognize some of these faces, especially that one. By the way, it's a lot of fun to work with Hnatyshyn. Hnatyshyn is a guy who spontaneously on his feet comes out with some crazy idea, which after a minute you realize is really deep and profound. Try him out. Ask him anything. So this effort with this committee, we did a literature search to find out why populations weren't diverse. we built a toolkit. Bernadette Boden-Albala is a dean in the School of Public Health at the University of California, Irvine, and an expert in this. We put her on the committee, used some of our toolkit, trained the investigators to do it, and we saw an increase in the populations we were trying to reach. It wasn't as good as I wanted or expected. The excuses that people gave us for why they couldn't recruit more women were really shocking, surprising, and I really did not expect them from a group of academics in this year. There's a lot of work we still have to do. By the way, if everyone's interested in this area, please do contact us because we're interested in launching future work to sort this out. One of the other things we did was we involved stroke survivors and their family in the design of this trial. In these consultations, our primary question was, what matters to you? They talked about the fear of a recurrence, having had one. They talked about the loss of autonomy, which led to inclusion of measures of function within the trial. Now, this is a trial in 37 countries, so we had to settle on measures which could be translated across 37 countries. We desperately need measures that we can apply broadly in these type of trials and are sensitive. Bleeding was very important, and they told us minor bleeding, the kind that in most trials is ignored, was hugely important. When they saw bruising, nosebleeds, what it meant to them was something bad was happening inside. It caused anxiety. Their mental health suffered. They told us that they would not wear short sleeves because they didn't want to display bruising. One of them said, I don't want people to think my husband is abusing me because I go out looking like this. So we put minor bleeding into the trial, made it a measure and a pre-specified secondary endpoint. Now, they said to me, when you do this, will you talk about the future? So here is what I want to say to you about the future. We've done very well in Canada in generating trials and leading trials. There are a few things that we have to do. The Canadian research ecosystem consists, like most, of a couple of elements. The first of these is people. We do need investigators and site investigators. Just before this, I was talking to Jody Edwards to pick her brain about how we incentivize people to become site investigators. One of my colleagues not so long ago said something which surprised me, which is, this is not worthwhile thing to pursue. What I can tell you is, as a young neurologist with my brand new master's in epidemiology, I learned a lot about trials as a site investigator. I learned what worked. I learned what didn't work. One of the things that we do at PHRI is if you participate in a trial, and OCEANIC had 702 sites with multiple investigators at each, if you have an idea and it works, it hasn't already been done or claimed in there, you are welcome to lead it. There is academic benefit. If it is already being done, we'll put you into that group. You will have authorship, you'll have a part of that for your career. Do not ever think that this is not worthwhile. I'll tell you something. I don't trust global PIs who have never been site investigators. How would they know? It's kind of like that old saying, right? That you don't trust a cook that doesn't eat their own food. Yeah, it is that. Site leads, hugely important. Site staffs, and the CSC has done a great job with research professionals. There's a group in this country, people are welcome to join, that meets regularly and shares learning. Now, nothing happens without funding, without the resources to do it. And there are a couple of sources here. Public funding. CIHR is a wonderful institution. The success rate for good stuff is abysmal, about 14% or so. We have had grants, good grants rejected. I've sat on the panels and felt my heart sinking as you go down the list and realize very good ideas from very promising people won't get funded. We do not fund research in this country at the level of NIH, and we need to seriously think about that and correct that. It has to do with our scientific, technologic, medical independence, which is becoming increasingly important. The third thing is data. Now, in the UK, there's a huge pool of data, which goes down to primary care, the biobank. They can do all sorts of things. Same is true of Denmark. The issue for us is we have 10 provinces which do not easily share data. There is CIHI data, but it's often not granular enough to answer the kind of questions that we have. EMRs proliferate. I will tell you, in our own city, from Hamilton Health Sciences to St. Joseph's Hospital, both of which have Epic systems, they have Epic systems that people have managed to create that do not talk to each other. And that is sad. Anytime, by the way, you're told it's impossible, don't believe it. But people are saying it's hard, and they equate hard with impossible. It's not. What you need is an interface that can translate between the two, and we desperately need to do this. There's data on Canadian patients, Canadian healthcare going to waste. One of the other things we need to do is support and develop our own pharma companies. Denmark, Sweden, Switzerland have massive pharma companies that build their own ecosystems. We do not. So if you, and I thank Mike Hill for doing this with NoNo, if you are involved with a young Canadian startup, I think you want to do whatever you can to help out. Most of them don't succeed, but when they do, it's tremendous. The other thing we need to do is make sure the pathways that lead to success in research are visible to young investigators, and stable. There has to be a way to get there. I've heard from bright, promising young learners that they don't see success for them as a possibility. Now, there are a couple of near-term issues which are threats to us. The last one there is really easy. We used to be sought internationally to do and run clinical trials in the 90s. We no longer are. In stroke, we stand up 20 sites. One of the Chinese stroke research networks stands up 250 over a weekend. And that is something we have to pay attention to and make sure we remain competitive. Most favored nation drug pricing. This is what you'll find if you Google that. And there it is. You're welcome to join this if you want. You just have to put in your email. This is at the White House website. And there's what it says. Basically, what it says is that we are tired of being ripped off. We get charged very high prices by pharma. Other countries get very low prices. We shoulder the burden of drug development. Now, I want to tell you something that I want you to keep just between us. And that is this. I have some sympathy for this position. Drug development is expensive, and rich countries ought to share an equal burden. There's a way of doing it, a sensible way we can think of based on GDP per capita, a whole bunch of things. That's not what's happening. What's happening is it's been determined by the US administration and enforced. What you can expect is drug prices will increase, including for asundexian, which will fall under this. The FDA has a requirement that the trials that it considers, and as a regulator, it's enormously powerful because that is the biggest drug market in the world. Trials it considers have to have a population representative of the US population. It used to be an unwritten rule that Canada was seen as a US equivalent, and that was about 10% of the population had to be in the US or US equivalents. They're increasing that to 20%, and Canada is no longer an equivalent. I've not yet seen the published FDA guidance, but we have it on very reliable authority that's going to happen. That will make Canada much less attractive for companies, for research that translates into change. Look, I have had a tremendously fun and enjoyable life. It hasn't gone in a straight line, and neither will yours. Enjoy the ride, when it happens. Take a moment to look backwards over everything that's happened. Anytime I look around, there are people around me who just plain make me better. They make me a better physician, a better scientist, a better leader, a better humorist. These are some of them. These are the names I could remember off the top of my head. There are others there. These are people I work with, people I do research with, people in the hospital, some family members, fellows, students who keep asking annoyingly difficult questions that get you thinking and moving and keep you young. Look, so let me just finish by saying this has been a tremendous honor. I'm truly humbled by it, and I thank you for your attention.